Hi, and welcome to the Men on the Path to Love podcast, the How Abusive Fathers Impact Men in Relationship episode. I'm Bill Simpson, your host. I coach men who are struggling in relationship, how to communicate effectively, build trust, and deepen intimacy so they can be the best version of themselves in relationship and live the life they love. And just an advisory for this episode, I'll be discussing abuse, and that might be triggering for some folks, so please remember to take care of yourself, okay? My father was not abusive. He was strict at times, and he had a real strong conservative opinion, yet he was never abusive. I knew that he loved me, and he showed me in his own way, and I am grateful in that respect. Yet over the years, I have witnessed over and over the negative impact that those who did grow up with an abusive parent or parents, the negative impact it can have on them individually, and the negative impact it can have on their adult relationships as well. This is especially true for men whose father was abusive. The impact can be very significant, like having trust issues. If he couldn't trust his parent, who could he trust, right? There could be intimacy and sexual issues, especially if there's any kind of sexual abuse. Having low self-esteem or self-worth, from being put down a lot or shamed a lot by a parent. Having difficulty expressing their feelings because maybe he wasn't allowed to. If he expressed his opinion or his feelings, he might get hurt, or he would get it in some kind of way if he did. And that goes along with shutting down emotionally, for the same reason, and using shutting down as a way to cope with all the pain. Avoidance is big too. Avoiding talking about things. Like I said, avoiding his feelings altogether. And again, using avoidance as a coping mechanism. It's too painful to deal with those feelings or having to talk, the anxiety it may create in having to talk about things. There could also be attachment issues, feeling insecure or jealous in the relationship. Having a hard time regulating his emotions is another one, like being angry or acting out aggressively, or feeling anxiety and not being able to focus or respond appropriately. Men who have been raised by an abusive father may have a hard time with setting healthy boundaries for themselves and having a hard time honoring their spouse's boundaries. Their boundaries could be all over the place. There could also be post-traumatic flashbacks or triggers from the PTSD caused by the abuse. The triggers that make them think of past abusive events and acting out in some kind of way. And there's always the risk of continuing the pattern of abuse with a spouse or partner or even with his child. And the good news here, though, is that with the proper guidance and support, men can heal, move forward in relationship, and live the life they love. And I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying it's possible. Like this story about Rick, not his real name. He grew up with a father who was very strict. He was mean and frankly abusive. Rick said that his father would constantly put him down and call him names. He would beat the crap out of Rick with a belt if he did something his father disapproved of. And Rick felt like he could never do anything right. He said that he was always afraid of his father and never once heard him say that he loved him. His mother tried to intervene at times, but his father would hit her as well, especially when he was drinking. And needless to say, it was a pretty rough childhood for Rick. Now, fast forward to his adult life, Rick had a really hard time maintaining healthy, long-lasting relationships. It wasn't until he was in his mid-30s that he met Sophie, not her real name. And as Rick put it, she was a sweet, understanding, and kind soul. And she could see the kindness in Rick's eyes, and that she knew that somewhere deep inside, there was something about him that made her feel like he was the one. And they fell in love and started a relationship. The closer they got, the impact of Rick's abusive past began to reveal itself. He struggled with trust and intimacy, and he was afraid to let Sophie get too close for fear of being hurt. And he also did everything he could to make sure Sophie wouldn't get mad at him, for fear that she would yell at him or put him down in some kind of way. And the communication in their relationship started to break down too. Rick was really good at keeping his feelings hidden because he had to during his childhood in order to protect himself and survive. He really couldn't express his feelings to Sophie, and it made it hard for Sophie to feel connected. And that resulted in misunderstandings, which led to a lot of arguments. Well, it was during one of those arguments where it all came to a head. After the argument had gotten heated, Rick broke down and started to sob. And Sophie had no idea what was going on. And once Rick calmed down, he opened up to Sophie about his abusive past. He told her all about how his father treated him. And he said that he was scared to talk about his feelings for fear that she would hurt him. And he told her how insecure he felt in the relationship, and that underneath, he was always scared that she would leave or turn against him. Well, it turned out that Sophie, at that moment, was really there for Rick. She listened with empathy and understanding, and she saw how deep Rick's pain was. And she acknowledged him for the strength it took for him to make himself so vulnerable and to share. And for once, Rick finally felt safe in a relationship, which was huge for him. And after all this, Sophie suggested that they get help and go to couples therapy. Now, before all this went down, Rick would have hands down said no, but he was totally open to it. And he confessed that deep inside he had always wanted to go to counseling, but was terrified of having to face all that he went through as a child. So they went to couples counseling, and Rick ended up going to individual therapy as well. He learned about how his abusive past impacted his relationship and how he behaves now. And he learned why he put his walls up and held his emotions inside. It was a way for Rick to cope with the trauma that he repeatedly went through as a child. Rick continued his healing journey with me, and it was definitely challenging for him. When someone has experienced the kind of trauma that Rick went through, it can be very challenging. Yet with Rick's commitment to his growth and having Sophie's continued support and love, he faced the challenge. And he did some amazing work too. He developed a stronger sense of himself through self-compassion and by facing the negative self-beliefs that his father reinforced through his abuse, and actually seeing the good in himself and the good that Sophie saw in him too. Well, over time, Rick got much better at being more mindful and expressing himself and communicating in a way that Sophie felt much closer to him. They collaborated in establishing healthy boundaries and building trust with themselves and in their relationship. And as Rick continued along his healing path, he and Sophie became closer than they had ever been. They ended up getting married and are in a really good space. Sophie's patience and consistent show of support played a huge role in Rick's growth. But most importantly, it was Rick's commitment that ultimately made it happen. Yeah, nothing happens until you commit, and Rick made it happen. So this was an amazing story, right? Yeah, and I have to say, it's rare. Because having an abusive father, or mother for that matter, but especially fathers for men, can have a serious effect on a man's emotional development and how they end up being in relationship. And it can be extremely difficult for men who have been through this type of trauma to open up and share their experience in order to heal. Yet in Rick's case, he was able to muster up the strength and courage to do the work and continue to heal. And he had great support from Sophie, which certainly helped. And frankly, it's not always the case, and it can be really hard. It is possible, though, so always keep hope alive. Here's a simple quote from author John Mark Green, which is a great reminder to anyone who's been the victim of abuse, or any trauma for that matter. He says, "You are not the darkness you endured. You are the light that refused to surrender." That's right. And that will do it for this episode of the Men on the Path to Love podcast, the How Abusive Fathers Impact Men in Relationship episode. I'm Bill Simpson, your host, and I thank you for listening. I know it's a tough listen, and I appreciate you taking the time to do so. So, the other day, my wife was watching a reality show about folks in relationship. And I was nearby working on something, and she asked me if I've done an episode on how to apologize in relationship. And I was like, no, why? She said the people on the show were awful at apologizing to their spouse or partner, telling me that they lacked sincerity and empathy. And she said one turned his apology into a blame. I was like, all right, enough said. I'll do it. So, please join me for the next episode of the Men on the Path to Love podcast, the How to Say You're Sorry episode. And thanks, my love, for the suggestion. And if you have a suggestion for a topic for an episode, or have an issue about your relationship you need help with, or have any comments or feedback about the podcast, I'd love to hear from you. Please email me at bill@pathways2livingwell.com. That's bill@pathways2livingwell.com. You can also find my email address in the show notes. And as always, if you know someone you think might benefit from listening to this podcast, I ask you to please share the link and share the love. And until next time, keep your heart open and stay on the path to love.